Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back to Jen's Books. I hope you've had a fantastic week and happy Friday. So this video is my first summary of reading for April. I've got quite a few books to go through with you, and I've read a real weird range of books this time. Some that I've really enjoyed, some lesser so, but hopefully amongst all these books there'll be something that maybe you fancy trying yourself or you've read. I'd really love to know, as usual, in the comments what your thoughts are or any recommendations that you have. So the first book that I'm going to tell you about, which I've read, is a well-known book, and what was quite annoying is I bought this as a library book and then got it out as a library book. Then when I was looking through my shelves earlier, I discovered I already had a copy of it. So the book is Howard's End by Forster. It was written in 1910, and this is quite a nice penguin edition. It's a book that I'd wanted to read for some time but hadn't done. Case in point that I had a copy of it and didn't even realise I already had it. And I'd read A Passage to India and quite enjoyed that a number of years ago, so I thought that I would give Howard's End a go. I think I had images of Helena Bonham Carter wandering around beautiful gardens when I picked this out to read at the beginning of the month. So I'm probably going to be a little bit unpopular really with some of my views on this. The book is about two grown-up orphans, Margaret and Helen, who are quite privileged. They live in comfort with their brother in a nice townhouse in London. They spend a lot of time thinking about how they can support the poor and culture generally. And Helen is quite a sort of headstrong, moralistic young woman, and Margaret is a bit more grounded, a bit more sober, and a bit more in connection really with reality of the turn of the century England. So what I will say, from halfway through the book I actually quite enjoyed it, but the first half of the book I found frustratingly slow. Nothing really very much happens. There's one scene where Helen and Margaret are entertaining a group of women and they're all sort of debating the social questions of the day, and they're talking about what is the best way to help those in need, who don't have access to money and don't have access to culture, and I found that quite frustrating. But it is, it's a book of its time, and it's an exploration of society at that time in 1910. So I suppose taking that into mind. But then about halfway through, Margaret, the older sister, she marries a much older gentleman called Henry Wilcox, and the Wilcoxes have quite a lot of money. The family's quite interesting in terms of their dynamics. They're very suspicious of this woman coming in and swooping in and marrying their father after they've not really long lost their mother, who was also friendly with Helen and Margaret. And then there's sort of a mystery of what's happened with Helen. Helen disappears off to Europe. They're originally from Germany, and she won't talk to them, and there's all a big mystery, and then in the end it all sort of kicks off. So from about halfway through I really enjoyed it, but for the first half I found it quite frustrating, and I don't know whether it's because I've been reading a lot more contemporary fiction recently, so reading something that's a little bit more slower paced, it takes a little bit more time to engage with. That it might be just me, so it'd be really interesting to know what your thoughts are if you've read Howard's End. I say from halfway through I did really enjoy it, but that first half I found a bit toe curling, I'll be honest. But if you're into classics, which I do like to read classic novels, Northanger Abbey is the next one on my list to read, then it's worth giving it a go. But as I say, I did find the first half quite slow. Secondly, I read a memoir called Heartberries, which is a really short memoir. It's by Terese Mailhot, and I spoke about this in my previous video on 6 memoirs, so I won't talk about it too much here, but I can put a link into the video about the memoirs. It was released in 2018, it had a lot of really positive acclaim. It's had really good reviews, including from the New York Times. It's basically a memoir of a woman who grew up in a reservation in America. She married young to escape her family, and then leaves a reservation, loses custody of her firstborn child as she's about to give birth to a second. But for some reason, they don't ask for custody of the second child, just the first one. So she ends up a single mother. She ends up in a institution with mental health challenges, and that's where portions of this book are written. She studies creative writing. She meets a professor who she falls in love with, who becomes a second husband, and this is kind of a love letter to him, and it's incredibly raw, it's incredibly impactful, and talks about all sorts of things, you know, drug abuse, sexual abuse, violence, love and loss. And it's a book that probably, if you're wanting to read but a bit worried about, you know, potential triggers, then possibly one that's worth having a little look at a bit more in detail online before you read. But it's a quick read. The style itself I found a little bit more challenging. It's quite fragmented, but I did enjoy the book. But I think that the way that the story sort of goes to and fro in time and is broken up in a certain way, sort of reflects the state of the mental health of the writer. So there is that side to it, but it is incredibly raw. And as I say, and I've heard from my subscribers as well, this is a book that people really enjoy. So certainly want to give it a go if it sounds like it's this kind of memoir that you'd be interested in. The third book I actually listened to, so it's an audio version. Hopefully I'll work out to put the photo up there of the book, which is Crying in H Mart, which is a 2021 memoir by Michelle Hare, who's a singer, guitarist and writer. It's her mother was Korean, her father was American, and it's about the loss of her Korean mother and the sort of links to that side of her heritage. It's incredibly rich in detail, very moving. She talks a lot about food in the memoir, and the connection between food and memory and culture and identity. So all of those sorts of topics are at play here. She started off quite a difficult young person by her own admission, but the book kind of trails through the story of her mum's really sad death, and how through that process of dying she became really close to her again. And it's about grief and it's about mourning. There's a lot of detail in here. At times it feels kind of a little bit list-like. I really love that, especially when they're talking about food. It's really sensual and really sensory, and I really enjoyed that part of it. But some readers might find that frustrating. But it's a really, really beautiful book, and there's an image in it that I think will stay with me for an awful long time, like a bruise in the head, which is after her mother dies, she goes into the bedroom and she lays on the bed, and her father's laying on the bed, the body of her mother, and then her and her new husband. So there's like this whole story really of these people laying in bed, the newlyweds and the new widow and the corpse, and that will really stay with me. I think it was really evocative. So if you're a fan of memoirs, definitely recommend it. It was incredibly evocative, very moving, but yeah, one I've heard quite a lot of good things about, and I'm really glad that I actually got round to reading. The next book is again something completely different from the previous two, which is Vox. I recently got out Femlandia from the library, which is also by the same author, Christina Dalcher, and Vox came out in 2018, so it's a few years ago now. And Femlandia is her new novel, which is also kind of an apocalyptic novel, but I felt like I needed to read Vox before I read Femlandia. So that's why I read it. So basically it's a story of a society where they're trying to silence women, and women are only allowed to say 100 words a day, and if they say more than that they get shocked. Literally, they have a bracelet with a counter on which counts how many words they're saying, and if they go over 100 they start getting shocks, and for every 10 words over that the shocks get stronger. So our narrator, or our central character, which is in first person point of view, is she's a scientist who actually specialises in language and the functions of the brain around language. So obviously Jean is quite frustrated by the turn of events. She's married, she has obviously a husband who works alongside the president, she has an older son of around 17, and then she has twin boys, and then she has a daughter called Sonia, who she's most concerned for, because obviously there's more and more restraints on what women can do. They can't work, you know, they can't even access the post, they can't read books, and in school they're sort of taught to be homemakers rather than you know, any sorts of sciencey subjects. When I originally got this book, it is one that I'd started before and then put down. It was a DNF, and I think at the time it felt too plausible, and it kind of still does to a certain extent, but at the time it felt too raw, and so I couldn't read it. So I'm glad that I have read it. You know, there's things I like about it. It's sort of reminiscent of The Handmaid's Tale, although I would suggest if you've not read The Handmaid's Tale, read The Handmaid's Tale rather than this. I didn't always follow 100% what was going on. It's a real thriller, but there were times where the action, I don't know whether it was my reading of it, but there were instances where I wasn't entirely sure where people were and who was doing what. But generally, it was an enjoyable read. It was a good thriller. She swears quite a lot in the book, which doesn't bother me, but I think because the whole idea of the women being silenced, that seems to stand out for me more. I don't know why, but it just feels louder for some reason because they're so quiet the rest of the time. But basically, Jean is asked by the president to do some work, some more scientific work, and they uncover this plot, and it's all about how they sort of overturn everything. So I would say, you know, if you like the sound of it, definitely give it a go. If it's between this and Handmaid's Tale, read Handmaid's Tale. But it was an interesting read, and I'm interested in reading Femilandia as well. It wasn't my favourite book I've ever read, but it was engaging, and it kept me turning the pages, certainly. So moving on from apocalyptic books to something completely different, I read Hare House by Sally Hinchcliffe, and those of you who follow the channel this may be familiar, because this was one of the books that was on my DNF list that I talked about in a previous video. It was a book that I kept picking up, I kept reading the opening of and then putting down. There was something about the narrator that just wasn't grabbing me, and it's basically a gothic story. It's about a unnamed narrator who moves up to Scotland after she loses her job as a teacher, and there's a whole backstory there to explore. And she gets embroiled with the family that lives in her Hare house, Grant and Cassie, Cass, who both live in the house. They've recently lost their parents, they've recently lost their brother, and Cass particularly is struggling with that sort of grief. And our central character becomes more and more involved in the family. She's quite attracted to Grant, and Cass as well. You know, even though she's a young woman, she's only 17, she sort of brings some brightness into her life, and she sort of gets drawn into the family. The symbolism of the hair comes up a lot in the book, and sort of the links to witchcraft. There's a lot of strange things going on that are quite ambiguous. We never really know why they're happening, whether it is something supernatural or whether it's something that, you know, people are actually doing to freak everyone out. Once I got past the beginning, I really enjoyed the book, actually. I think it sort of suffered the same way that Eleanor Oliphant is absolutely fine suffered. The narrator isn't particularly likeable to begin with, doesn't really grab you, but if you continue with it, you know, then it's worth reading. And exactly the same with Eleanor Oliphant, which I absolutely loved. It was worth persevering with. So there's some good atmosphere in here. It's quite creepy and gothic. It's an old decaying house in the middle of the Scottish countryside, and they get snowed in, and just down the hill is the place where there's a history of car crashes where the family have died. That's quite an ambiguous ending as well. So if you like that sort of ambiguous, witchcrafty, gothic kind of feeling, snuggle up in the dark. It'd be nice to read in autumn, this one, I would have said. Then yeah, I would definitely recommend this, and I'm really glad that I actually persevered and went back to it and read it. So that's one off the pile, off the wall, that has been there for some time and hadn't been read. And what surprised me about this is actually it's not a very old book. I think it came out in 2022. I thought that I'd had it longer than that, so I have had it a while, but not as long as I thought. But definitely one that I'd recommend. Hare House by Sally Hinchcliffe for the lovers of the Gothic. Anybody who's watching this channel, I'm sure you will have heard of Taylor Jenkins Reid. She's been all over the place with the 7 husbands of Evelyn Hugo being one of the books. I've read that book, I'd read Malibu Rising, and I'd read Daisy Jones and the Six. So when I saw this, you know, on sale, I thought I'd give it a go. It's called One True Loves. And what really got me with this book, it's one of her earlier books, was the premise, which is the idea that Emma married her childhood sweetheart called Jesse, and they travelled around the world, but unfortunately he dies, or it disappears, and is believed dead when a helicopter goes down in the Pacific. And she's absolutely distraught. Jesse was the love of her life, and then she goes on to reconnect with an old friend from her childhood, and they fall in love and become engaged. But then she gets a phone call from Jesse to say that he survived and he's been living on a desert island all this time. So she has to sort of come to terms with, you know, the fact that the love of her life isn't dead and has been waiting for her all this time on this desert island, and yet she's also in love with Sam. So that's where the title One True Loves comes from. I mean, this is definitely, I would say, an earlier book. You can tell it's an earlier book. If you haven't read any Taylor Jenkins Reid, I wouldn't start with this one. Start with the Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. That is an immense book. That's really awesome. Or any of the other ones that I've mentioned. This is much more pared back. It's really about the emotions and about the romance between these characters. What I didn't like about it particularly was both men are absolutely perfect. You know, how can she pick? They're both so wonderful. You know, they really are saccharine, perfect men. And I found that, I don't know, just a bit implausible, you know, that they were both so perfect and there was no bad memories with either of them really. And also the way the book sort of unravels, I found there were elements of it that were quite implausible in the resolution. However, it was still a nice page turning. I can imagine this would be a really nice holiday read actually, and the premise was one that really grabbed me straight away, which is why I you know, I couldn't wait. As soon as I bought it, I pretty much read it. But as I say, if you found it, you've read her work before and you've really enjoyed it, then yeah, definitely pick it up. But if you haven't read her work before, I wouldn't start with this one unless you're really into sort of light, sort of romantic fiction, in which case you might enjoy it. So the next book that I read was one that actually there's been quite a lot of talk about and debate about. I've seen people say that this was one of the worst books of the year last year, or it was one of their favourite books of the year last year, and that's Lapvona by Ottessa Moshfegh. And I've got a few books by Ottessa Moshfegh. I've got Eileen and I've got A Year of Rest and Relaxation, neither of which I've read yet, so I am going to read those, and they both seem quite different in terms of premise to this one. But sort of my response really was, I didn't hate it, I didn't love it, it was a bit odd, there were things I enjoyed about it. I definitely kept wanting to read it, I did turn the pages on it, but it's not one I'm probably going to reread anytime soon. So the premise basically is there's a young boy called Marek who lives with his father Jude. His mother Agata, we've been told she died, but actually turns out she was kind of held hostage by Jude, and then she escaped after she's given birth to Marek and ran away to the nunnery, and she comes back later in the book, spoilers. But Marek has a physical disability, and one of the things that I did feel slightly uncomfortable in this book was the way that that's kind of used as a way of making him almost grotesque. And there's a lot about making people feel uncomfortable in this book, definitely. I mean, that is clearly an aim in the book. And none of the characters are particularly likeable. I can't think of a single character in the book that I really liked or could sympathise with 100%. Agata probably, because of everything she's been through. But it's sort of based in a medieval town during a drought somewhere in Europe, I would say, and the lord of the manor has had all the water diverted to kind of keep him and his family in food and vegetables and food, and keeping the animals grazing while everyone down in the village is slowly starving to death. And Marek is involved in the death of Jacob, who is the son of the lord, and instead of being punished, the lord decides to take Marek as his son. So Marek goes from being a starving sort of outsider in his village to being the son of the Lord of the Manor. So there's a real change of turn in events in it. So there's some interesting plotting in this. I did enjoy it. As I say, it was really accessible, easy to follow, but I wouldn't say it was the worst book I've read from 2022. I wouldn't say it was the best. And I'm intrigued enough to want to read those other books by Ottessa. And, you know, as I say, it kept me turning the pages, and I did finish it. But yeah, I think it was designed to kind of shock. So if you're not really interested in books that, you know, have that sort of a premise to them, it might not be one you want to pick up. If you like historical fiction that's slightly odd and carnivalesque, I would say, then this might be something that you enjoy. Again, completely different book from that one. This is another library book, and this is Maureen Fry and the Angel of the North. One of the reasons I picked this up is because the first book of the trilogy, which is The Pilgrimage of Harold Fry, is just about to be released as a film with Jim Broadbent, who I think is amazing and everything. And I loved that book, The Pilgrimage of Harold Fry, and it's a story about this 60-year-old man who wanders across the country to go and visit his friend Queenie, who he discovers is dying of cancer. And so he goes on foot halfway across the country to make a final visit. It's like keeping her alive, a sense of faith in going to visit her. Then there's a second book which is about Queenie's life, and this is the third one. I haven't actually read the one about Queenie, so I feel like I need to go back and read it. But I also don't think you need to really have read any of the books in order particularly, although I would recommend reading The Pilgrimage first because I think it is the standout of the three. But this is the story of Maureen, who is a sort of very prickly character. She's Harold's wife, and she discovers that Queenie has this garden halfway across the country where she has a memorial to Queenie's son, and she feels like she needs to travel there to go and see it. She decides not to, but she doesn't walk all the way there, she drives, which is eventful in itself. This is 10 years since the first book, so they're both characters are now in their 70s, and it's a big drive across the country for her, and all sorts of hijinks follows. It's interesting because Maureen is a very different character from Harold. Harold meets people, makes friends along the way, creates connections, whereas Maureen has learned to put up a lot of boundaries around herself. She's quite a prickly character, but still likeable, but she doesn't find it easy to reach out to people. So I really enjoyed the book. It was quite a quick read, and I particularly enjoyed it because I'd read, you know, A Pilgrimage of Harold Fry. But if you've read any Rachel Joyce before, you'll probably enjoy this. Rachel Joyce is lovely as well. She's a writer I've met, and she's an absolute joy, so that always helps as well. But yeah, definitely recommend. Because I delayed making this film, I read one more, and that's Camilla Gradova's Children of Paradise, which was published in 2022, July I think 2022, and it's one of the books that's been longlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction. And I knew as soon as I heard this described as similar to Angela Carter that I was going to enjoy it, and I really, really did. I really loved this book, so much so I read it on my Kindle that I actually really want to get a paper copy as well so I can reread it. So it's the story of an unnamed narrator, but she calls herself Holly for the sake of the story, and she's new to the city, she needs a job, and so she gets a job in this old sort of decrepit cinema, very sort of traditional, hasn't really been done up, and all the staff there are kind of outsiders in different ways. And to begin with, when she first starts working there, they all sort of block her out and ignore her, but as time goes on she gets drawn into this friendship, and they become like a family of outsiders whose lives exist around this cinema and around films. In fact, each chapter is named after a different film, and I think people who really like cinema will probably get references that I maybe didn't pick up on, but the actual sort of grubbiness and the nocturnal life of these characters I really enjoyed, and the sort of the cinema where things start to happen that could be supernatural, but it's very ambiguous. So there is that touch of magic realism, which I think is what they were talking about when they're talking about Angela Carter. But I really enjoyed this book, and I would definitely recommend it for those who are sort of working their way through the Women's Prize long list. I'm not sure whether it will make it to the short list, But for me, out of the books I've read so far, I've really enjoyed it, probably more than any of the others. I'm also listening to Demon Copper Head at the moment, so which is amazing. So they might have competition yet, but I really recommend the Children of Paradise if you like that sort of dark, grubby, wanting to know what happens on the other side but not really wanting to know, and you know, this sort of band of characters who have nothing but each other really, and what happens as when the cinema sort of changes and what happens to all of these characters. I really enjoyed it. She also has written a collection of short stories called The Doll's Alphabet, which I've now had to order off the back of this, and I think those are her only publications so far, which is just not unfair, not fair at all. It's one of those things, it's one of those books that I read that I wish that I'd written. It's just fantastic. But those are my books so far for April. I hope that there's something on there that sounds of interest to you. I'd love to know what your thoughts are. Do let me know in the comments. If you're new to the channel, my name's Jenny, and my challenge is to read 100 books in 2023. I think I've read about 60 already, so I'm doing really well. And I'm reviewing those with you lot, as you lovely lot, as a way of sort of being accountable as to myself for reading those books. So if that sounds like something that might interest you, do subscribe, do come along for the ride, and I'll see you again next time. Thanks. Bye.